So let's get started. So have either of you seen Fight Club? Yeah, okay. So what's the first rule of Logical Form Club? You don't talk about logical form. That's really kind of, I think, at the heart of Wittgenstein's story. That I take it the sort of reason why, or one reason why he thinks everything he says is nonsense is because his whole theory of meaning presupposes an appeal to logical form. But logical form is going to be a presupposition of the meaningfulness of our language. And so he thinks because it's a presupposition in this way, it's something we can't say. Yeah, it's a precondition of all saying. Now you might think, well, why can't it be a precondition of all saying? Why does something being the precondition of something means that the thing itself can't explain it? Yeah, so I think we might want to think about that. But before understanding the centrality of logical form, so linguistic picturing requires the existence of logical form. And the idea is that the world and the language share this logical form. And it's because they've got a shared logical form that our language is able to picture the world. So the relationship of picturing presupposes some sort of shared form. That's the idea. Now, not all picturing is linguistic. So we have spatial models. And in spatial models, that the form that is shared is not logical form, but spatial form. Yeah, so for example, on my screen, this represents Saba, this represents Derin, and this represents Lucas. Yeah, so I've got three things, yeah, that are spatially related to each other. And these three things can then be used to represent the spatial relations between three objects. I can use these three objects as a way of representing the spatial relations between Saba, Lucas, and Derin. Yeah, and the reason I can do this is because the model exists. The model is something in the world, and so it shares a form with what's modeled. Both the thing that is modeling and the thing modeled share a spatial form. Yeah, and it's because the model and the reality, in this case a pictorial model, share this spatial form, that the model is able to be a model of the world. And such a model can be false. So if this represents Derin and I move it here, this is a kind of false representation of the world, because the spatial relationships of the elements of the model that represent you guys, yeah, are not in the same relationship as they are in the model as they are in the world. So if I put these three things in this relation, then this satisfactorily sort of models the spatial relations between you. Now, of course, the spatial dimension is not the only dimension. Yeah, so it may turn out that what's central is the color of the objects. And it may turn out that there isn't a kind of shared color form. Yeah, and so the color differences between objects doesn't really reflect necessarily anything in the things pictured. In a painting, you might think, yeah, that the bits of the painting, the parts of the painting, have spatial relationships to one another, that somehow in an accurate painting mirror the spatial relationships of the things depicted in the painting. Yeah, but they also may have the relationship between the colors of the parts somehow relates to something about what's going on in the object. So when we're thinking about picturing and form and models and the way in which the modeling presupposes some identity of form, I think the first case we may think of is this example of the motor car accident. So when working on the Tractatus and thinking about Russell, he suddenly had this epiphany when he was in the trenches being, shot at by the Russians about reading this, about a court case in Paris where a law court represented different versions of what was different versions of a traffic accident using toy cars and puppets. Yeah, and these toy cars and puppets offered different models of the accident. You had the defense, you had the prosecution, and each of them had a different version of events, which then they tried to model. And so that this idea of modeling, we have some notion of accuracy, which I take it a spatial model of something can either be an accurate or an inaccurate depiction. And this is the kind of an analog of the notion of truth. Yeah. So accuracy conditions of a model are something like, or truth conditions are one version of something like accuracy conditions of a model. The second thing that that helped him get an idea of modeling, I think, had to do with Hertz. So Hertz, that with electricity, hold on, there's someone at the doorbell. Was he complaining about it? Yeah. Mummy took out Alijan, but Alijan had a key ring and he dropped it before he went out and he's just spent the whole time complaining. Alijan? Here it is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So the other kind of thought about modeling that influenced Wittgenstein, and we've got clear evidence of this, is Hertz's discussion of models in his textbook of dynamics. So he says the relation, and remember he was working in aeroplane dynamics. So one of the things he was doing as an engineering student was having models, small models of aeroplanes in wind tunnels, yeah, to learn something about some larger object, so that you can learn things about what happens in the big thing in terms of what happens in the physical model. But then you can have these sort of dynamic mathematical models that can work in the same way. So he says the relation of a dynamical model to the system of which it is regarded as the model is precisely the same as the relation of the pictures which our mind forms of things to the things themselves. For if we regard the condition of the model as the representation of the condition of the system, then the consequence of this representation, which according to the laws of this representation must appear, are also the representation of the consequence which must proceed from the original objects according to the law of this original object. Now, did that make sense? Or was it? It's a bit. So you've got a model, and in the model, you have a description about how things are at the moment. And then this mathematical model then tells you if you start off in this condition, this is how things will be 5 minutes later. Yeah. So you've got a description of the way things are, and then you've got a bunch of maths saying if you start here, this is where you'll end up. So if you start at A, you'll end up at B. You'll have another sort of description or model of the way things are. Now, if it's a good model and the initial condition captures the way things are in the things modeled, and that the laws that govern the model in some sense mirror the laws that govern reality, then if in the model it says you're going to go from A to B, then in reality you're going to go from the current state to a state that somehow is represented by part B in the model. Yeah, that's the basic idea. Yeah, so he says the agreement between the mind and nature, yeah, may therefore be likened to the agreement between two systems which are models of one another. And we can even account for this agreement by assuming that the mind is capable of making actual dynamic models of things and of working with them. Yeah, so the sort is that we sort of represent the world by forming models of it. And so a mental representation of reality is a model of reality. And because if we have a dynamic model, which is a model that sort of involves the idea that if you start in this particular state, this is how things will unfold in the future, then you can kind of use facts about what happens to the model to make predictions about what will happen to the thing modeled. Yeah, that's what you're doing if you're an aerospace engineer. You've got a small model airplane and you're doing, so you've got this model in the courthouse, you've got models used by aeronautical engineers, and then you have something like mathematical models. This is what Hertz is talking about. And they all sort of work in the same sort of way. I take it this is the sort of idea. And Wittgenstein, the thing about mathematical models is you've got a little bit more of kind of a higher level of abstraction than in the simple models. Now, so in the background, we've got this idea that we can understand meaning and content and representational content of language in terms of the fact that somehow language models the world. That's the first thing. Secondly, we have this insight that I think Wittgenstein got from the court case, is that when one thing models another, there's got to be some sort of shared form. So, and the form itself can't be represented by the model. Yeah, so, you know, the model, our model of the accident is in space, but it doesn't represent space. Yeah, the model is in space, it has spatial form, but a spatial model can't represent space itself. Yeah, what it does is it presupposes that there's this sort of spatial form, and it's the fact that it's spatial that allows this model in the courtroom to model what happened on the streets of Paris. Yeah, but the model itself can't depict the space. A spatial model can't depict its spatiality, but in some sense it shows its spatial nature. Yeah, this is the distinction between saying something and showing something. So logical form, the logical form of a proposition, which is somehow something that the proposition shares with reality, is something that language presupposes, but and that in some sense can be shown through the use of language, but we can't, Wittgenstein thinks, we can't say anything about logical form. But what did I just do? I violated the first law of, you know, logical form club. Yeah, this is the story. So that's the sort of picture. So in order to kind of get this theory of meaning So I've got a more traditional view of Wittgenstein, of the Tractatus, which I do think he is trying to offer a theory of meaning, but it turns out to be one that we can't explicitly state. But once we've read the Tractatus, I think we in some sense are shown how this theory of meaning works, but we can't explicitly say how it works. But that in order for this theory to work, we've got to give an account of the way the world is, and then we've got to give an account of the way language is, in such a way to explain how there can be this relationship of picturing between language and the world. Yeah, so how does he start off? So he starts off by talking about the world. So he says the world is all that is the case. Now this is, you know, this is a description of the world that is going to make the world in some sense, I think, suitable for our linguistic capacities. Yeah, so what he's trying to do is he's giving a description of the world in such a way that it's going to make our capacity to think about the world possible. The world, insofar as it's thinkable for us, must be thus and so. I think this is the sort of picture. I think this, if you think about it in these terms, you might think then this pushes him towards a certain form of idealism, because he's giving a description of the way the world is in service of the idea that the world is something that can be thought about using propositions. Yeah. And so in order to be a possible object of thought, this is the way the world must be. The world as thinkable must be so. It's going to turn out that the world as thinkable, it turns out there's no causation, there's no subjects. Yeah, the I is not part of this world. There are no values. So the world, insofar as it can be grasped by thought, is the totality of facts, not of things. Yeah, and what is the case is a fact. It's the existence of a state of affairs. So we've got this distinction between facts and states of affairs. That a fact is the way the world actually is. States of affairs, I take it, are all the ways the world could be. Yeah. So states of affairs are going to be something like ways the world could be. Yeah. So we've got, and it turns out that language, a scientific language, is such that it can and must only be able to say things about states of affairs, where states of affairs are possible ways the world could be. Now, ultimately, that we have objects and properties and relations, and the possible states of affairs are going to be all the different ways the elements can somehow be combined with one another. So suppose you've got, in your world, you've got two objects, yeah, and then you've got two relations, and let's say you've got negation. So you could have Saba and Derin, and, you know, one possible, and love. So you've got, you know, Saba loves Derin, Derin loves Saba, Saba, you know, these are the options. Yeah, there's two possible states of affairs. So let's say to the left of, or on top of. So Saba is on top of Derin, or Derin is on top of Saba. On the screen, that's how you are. So Saba is on top, Derin is below. So let's suppose you've got kind of two objects and one relation being above. Yeah, that it turns out that there are two possible states of affairs. either Saba is on top of Derin or Derin is on top of Saba. Yeah. And so Wittgenstein's going to develop a view of possibility. The possibility has got to do with the way in which the objects can somehow be combined or recombined. Now, so he says a state of affairs, yeah, is a combination of objects, things. Yeah, so a state of affairs is a combination of objects. Now, that as I understand objects here, there's a sort of disagreement about how to so we've definitely got individuals. I've been using Saba and Derin. I guess we might think of these objects as sense data. Yep. We might have a phenomenalistic reading of this. Wittgenstein wants to remain completely neutral about the kind of what objects there are. But I take it that amongst his objects are going to fall into three classes. So there are individuals, there are properties, and there are relations. Yeah, so a state of affairs is a combination of objects. Is going to be something like, well, you've got one object is Saba, another object is happiness, and then one state of affairs is Saba combined with happiness. Saba is happy. Yeah, that's going to be one state of affairs. So I'm taking, when he's talking about things, I think that he thinks that the basic classes of things are individuals, properties and relations, and they form the kind of, in some sense, the basic building block of reality. Although in some sense he wants to say the states of affairs are somehow prior to the atoms that make them up. Yeah, so there's a slight complication here. It's not like you have all the possible things and then you've got all the ways of combining them. But in some sense, that there's at least some sense in which states of affairs are metaphysically prior to the things. Now, and so one thing is that, you know, Russell had this philosophy of logical atomism. And I think Wittgenstein's view is slightly different from this. So he says, in logic, nothing is accidental. If a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. Yeah, so now, what does this mean? What is it for the possibility? So if a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. Any thoughts? So one thing is, at least part of this is going to involve knowing what we might think of in the linguistic. So we've got this theory, account of what the world is. Yeah. It's being developed in the service of a theory of meaning. So for these things in the world, there are going to be things in our language which correspond to these things in the world. So in our language, you might think we have names of individuals and then something like predicates. Today, I think in logic, we think there are just two types of things. There are names of individuals and predicates. And we don't make a kind of strong distinction between one-place predicates and two-place predicates and three-place predicates. So we don't have a kind of radical distinction between properties and relations. Yeah, a relation just is a two-place predicate. Yeah. I think Wittgenstein kind of keeps this quite radical distinction between properties and relations. So we have, you might think that one thing is that, so you've got an individual, and an individual is something that can, so let's think about on the linguistic side. So you've got a name, and once you've got a name, this can occur in, any predicate can be predicated of a name. Yeah, Wittgenstein thinks. Yeah, so if you've got an individual, then for any possible predicate, this individual can occur together with the property. Yeah, that he thinks that whenever you've got an individual and you've got a two-place relation, the individual can occupy one part of the relation, and that's going to be a possible state of affairs. Yeah, so you could have Saba can be combined with happiness, can be combined with sadness, can be combined with every possible predicate. Also, she can occur in any possible relation. Yeah, so Saba loves A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Is, yeah, A, B, C, D, E, F, G is loved by Saba. These all name possible states of affairs. So the thought of from the linguistic side, that to know, so in logic, nothing is accidental. If a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. So the sort of idea here is, I think the central idea here is that whether or not something, so like, you can't say loves Lucas, yeah? That loves is not something that can occur as one of the relata in a relation. You can't say loves is happy, yeah? And that's written into the logic of loves, because loves is a relation. And so loves can only occur in states of affairs where you've got kind of two individuals on either side of it. Yeah. Is happy is red. That's nonsense. Yeah. Happiness and redness can't be combined into a state of affairs. Yeah. But like this pen and redness can be combined. Individuals can have the property of being red. So the claim that in logic, nothing is accidental. If a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. At least partially what this has got to do with is that in logic, we have this kind of radical distinction between predicates, we have between predicate terms, and names of individuals and relations. Yeah. And there are sort of grammatical rules or logical rules that say that Lucas is not a valid sentence. So in the world, Lucas cannot be combined with, I don't know, with Zubaydah to form a fact. There has to be something else. There has to be something like loves, or is married to, or is kind of, there has to be that two individuals cannot of themselves form part. Yeah, so some people can see numbers as colors as well. Yeah, so one problem with the Tractatus is that Wittgenstein sort of explicitly committed to that in this world, any individual can be combined with any property. Yeah, so in this world, that if you've got properties and individuals, that the combination of an individual is possible with every property. Yeah, and that that you may think this is going to be problematic, because you might think that, you know, Saba can be happy, but this cup cannot be happy. Yeah, so not every so whether or not one thing can be combined with another is not purely a matter of their sort of grammatical role or what part of speech they are. And I think that Wittgenstein thought that in an ideal language, that once you've got a language that names all the real individuals, all the real properties and all the real relations, then all of the possible combinations that are sort of grammatically correct are really possible. Yeah, so he says in logic nothing is accidental. So you might think that, you know, sorry, where is Darren's? Yeah, like, you know, sadness is red. Is sadness the name of an individual? Is it the name of a property? Yes, but Wittgenstein thinks that in order for language to be meaningful, and languages, we can use language to talk about the world. And for this to be possible, Wittgenstein thinks the world has to be such that we can use language to talk about it. Yeah, and that this presupposes that any, you know, yeah, this is his, and I think this sort of idea is sort of crazy, and Wittgenstein ended up, this is what led him to reject the kind of position of the Tractatus. So he says, if I know an object, I also know of all its possible occurrences in states of affairs. Every one of these possibilities must be part of the nature of the object. So it's written into the object what it can be combined with and what it can't be combined with. That's given somehow by the nature of the states of affairs. So the claim is that if all objects are given, then at the same time, all possible states of affairs are given. So if you've got a list of all the individuals, of all the properties and all the relations, then basically the kind of grammatically correct combinations of all of these names will give you a complete description of everything that's possible. That's basically the idea. Yeah, you've got the individuals, you've got properties, and you've got relations. And once you've got those, you know everything that's possible. Yeah, that's basically the idea.
But what about if we can also form sentences about God, but that does not mean the existence of God? Like that does not prove the existence of God.
Yeah, so one thing that Wittgenstein is very shy about here is he just doesn't tell us what these objects are. Yeah, now my sort of take is that that he's really following Russell and thinking about what we can talk about in this ideal language is going to be our sense data. So that the objects are going to be things like points in, the individuals are going to be points in our visual field, for example. The properties are going to be things like colors. And then you might think the relations are going to be things like spatial relations. Yeah. And then the idea is that you can give, then that gives you an account of all of the, so I mean, think about a kind of computer screen. So our computer screen is made of pixels. So let's think of each pixel as an individual. Yeah, we could have a name for it. Then let's think that each pixel can be 36 colors. So there's 36 different properties. And then in some sense, let's forget about the relations. I don't know, that let's say the pixels can't move. yeah, then that one can sort of know all the ways. If the world is just like a screen like this, one can know all the ways the world could be is just going to be, for every pixel, there's 36 different opportunities, there's 36 different possibilities. Yeah, so the kind of the sum total of possibilities is the all the possible ways the objects and the properties could be combined. Yeah, so he says the possibility of it occurring in states of affairs is the form of an object. Now, once again, this idea of the form of the object, this is something we can't talk about. Yeah, but there has to be a form of the object, and the sort of idea is that the form of language and the form of if the form of language and the form of the object are the same, then this explains how language can depict the world. So in language, we have a grammatical distinction between subject and predicate. And maybe in the world, we have a real distinction between individuals and properties. Yeah. And the individuals can have certain properties. Yeah. And that's going to be the form of, yeah, what is the form of an individual? Well, it's got the possibility to be this color or that color, to be next to this thing or that thing. That gives you the nature of the object. And that gives you, I think, he thinks, at least partially, this is going to be the logical form of the object. The logical form, an individual is going to have a very different form than a property. So redness, being red, that can occur in a state of affairs by being a property of this patch or that patch or that patch or that patch. Darren, so I think this picture is very, what's the word? It turns out that for linguistic meaning to be possible, the world that it refers to has to be, in some sense, lacking in a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, the world just turns out to be this world where all you get is the possibility of combinatorics. There's no meaning and the like. And I think that's Wittgenstein's position. And that's what pushes him towards, I think, a certain form of mysticism. That the world, yeah.
Then why did he write this book at all, even if he thinks that way? Like the thing we mentioned in last lesson, like it doesn't make any sense, I think, for me.
Well, I mean, so here's a sort of story. So, Wittgenstein is from Vienna. One of the people who I think was influenced by is Freud. And so that we have these sort of philosophical worries. And, Freud, you have some sort of neurosis. And the way to get around this neurosis is to go through some sort of talking therapy. Yeah. And you get over your neurosis through sort of talking. And so I think that, yeah, Wittgenstein, and this becomes much more apparent in the later Wittgenstein, very strongly sees philosophy in therapeutic terms. Yeah, so the task of philosophy is to sort of, or of carrying on with philosophy, is to kind of cure us from philosophical neuroses. So we've got certain worries that we express in language. And then the sort of thought is that these sort of worries just are things that can't be said. And somehow when you come to see that, now his later view, I think, is a much richer, more plausible view about how language works. So he gets rid of the picture theory and has this idea of meaning as sort of use. And he has this idea that you know, philosophical problems occur when we use words in context where we don't know how to use them. Yeah, so when language goes on holiday. But I take it that the sort of thought is this offers us a way to overcome certain types of philosophical neurosis. I think that was Wittgenstein's sort of idea. So he wrote this, and then he gave away all of his possessions, I think became quite a strong Catholic, and then became trained to be a high school teacher or a middle school teacher, for which he was totally unsuited and very bad. You know, he was not someone who really should. Yeah, but but the question you're asking is like the big question of Wittgenstein scholarship. Like, if it's all nonsense, why are you writing it? I take it though that, so you might think though that, so the idea of the form of an object. So one thing is that, you know, maybe he's too harsh on himself. So maybe we can understand logical forms. I think some Wittgenstein scholars and some fans of Wittgenstein actually like Wittgenstein's early work, but think he's just wrong about this idea that we can't say anything about logical form. So you might think that we can have some understanding of form analogically. So the way I tried to get you to understand logical form was by talking about spatial form. Yeah, and talking about how, in order for a spatial model to represent something in space, if they share the same sort of spatial form, this allows, so, and you know, language doesn't work in terms of its spatial, well, it doesn't, it turns out spatial form is going to be important, but the form that's shared between language and the world is logical form, not spatial form. So perhaps we can use language to talk about spatial form, yeah, and whether or not two things have a shared spatial form. We can use the language of mathematics, for example, and introduce quite rigorous notions of isomorphism, yeah. And then once we've got that, then we say, well, the logical form is to be understood sort of analogically, yeah. So I think Wittgenstein himself doesn't want to go that way. But you might think, yeah, that we can't describe logical form, but maybe we can sort of understand it analogically. Maybe Wittgenstein's doing a bit of that.
Yeah, okay, I understand.
Yeah, but I take it that he's offering a picture of the way the world must be in order for our language to be precise and meaningful. And then it turns out, I think we end up with a sort of castrated world. And I think Wittgenstein's conclusion is that, yeah, but that's not because that's the way things deeply really are, but it's just because that what we're after is a conception of the world that goes together with, that makes language possible. And it turns out that the important things in life are things that maybe can't be said. So I think that the early Wittgenstein is very much a sort of mystic here. Yeah, that he thinks that this conception of the world he gives us is a conception of the world we need for language to be possible. But it turns out that to possibly capture what's going on in the world, but it turns out that this conception of the world is anemic. It lacks any value. It lacks anything solid. Yeah.
But the language here should not just be about the words here, right? Like the body language or other kinds of all other languages count here as well, right?
Yeah, so I think Schaffer once said, well, what's the logical form of this? And he gave some sort of Italian swear gesture. Yeah, and so this was an early, I think, quite effective criticism of Wittgenstein, because, you know, you've got certain gestures that seem to be quite meaningful, but don't seem to have something like compositional structure. Yeah, so, but I take it that the sort of thought is that if you've got the basic elements of reality, if there are kind of laws that govern the way in which they can occur together, they could be combined. And then if you've got language and there are rules concerning the way bits of language can be combined, if the rules that govern the combination of in reality are in some sense the same as the rules that govern the combination in your symbol system, then this allows us to understand how our language can in some sense depict the world. Yeah, so he introduces very early on this notion of form, and the form is sort of built into the objects because it's built into objects. The possibility of combination is sort of built into the building blocks. Yeah, so I think it's not, he hasn't got this straight atomism that we sort of find in Russell. Okay, so next class we're going to carry on. What I want to do first is I want to work through this handout that gives the kind of an overview of the first 3 numbered sections of the, or 4 is it? The first 3 numbered sections of the Tractatus. And it's sort of slow going because as we move on, each sentence is something we can spend a lot of time on. But I think maybe you can see the basic idea of where this is going. Yeah, my sort of I'll put it on the. Hold on, I'm going to have to close the handout to be able to send it to you. Let me do it now. Yeah, so I had 2 handouts. I had one handout from last class. Let me find it. Yes, I had something on Russell and something on Wittgenstein. I was invited to give some lectures on Wittgenstein in Madrid a while back, so I originally made the handout for there. Yeah. Okay, so I've got to run now because I've got my Kant class. Next week, I'm going to be in Turkey. Maybe the week after that, if anyone's around, we can
please
do it face to face. Well, I'll do it by Zoom as well for those who can't. It's not exactly clear, where we'll be coming back. I guess after the elections, people might just be too depressed to do anything, or too happy. I don't know. I think it's going to be for a lot of people.
It will be not definite again because it could also, it would not be finished in the first time.
Yeah.